Welcome back to Decode Healthcare with Harshal. If you were with us for Part 33, you know we kicked off Chapter 1 by mastering the incredibly strict coding rules for HIV. Well, today, we're taking on a brand new mission in Part 34 of our explainer. We're tackling the notoriously complex ICD-10-CM Section I.C1D to finally conquer the sepsis sequencing mountain. Now, I know this is widely considered one of the absolute hardest topics in medical coding, but here's the truth. Mastering this sequencing roadmap is completely non-negotiable if you want to pass your certification exams and survive those intense compliance audits. So we're going to break down this intimidating mountain into a clear, structured path.
Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. Section 1 is the Sepsis Coding Challenge. Section 2 is the Severe Sepsis Stack. Section 3 is the Admission Crossroads. Section 4 covers defeating payer denials, and Section 5 is our final coding takeaways.
But before we take a single step up this mountain, we've got to firmly establish our source of truth. The official CMS guidelines take absolute precedence over any textbooks, cheat sheets, or clinical assumptions you might be holding on to. We're relying entirely on the CMS ICD-10-CM official guidelines for coding and reporting. This source strictly overrides everything else, period. So if a payer or a provider tries to argue a coding sequence based on a textbook, you point them right back here.
Section 1, the Sepsis Coding Challenge.
We begin our climb by looking at baseline sepsis and a major terminology pitfall you absolutely have to avoid in your daily coding. For a baseline diagnosis of sepsis, you always assign the appropriate code for the underlying systemic infection first. See, sepsis is an inflammatory condition in response to microorganisms, right? So the code needs to actually reflect that causal organism. For example, if it's streptococcal sepsis, you'd use a code from category A40. But if the provider just writes sepsis and the organism is completely unspecified, you default to A41.9, sepsis unspecified organism. Fun fact though, defaulting to A41.9 without really digging into the chart is literally one of the fastest ways to trigger an internal audit. The golden rule is you never just guess, you code the systemic infection that's documented.
Now here's a massive red flag: urosepsis. It's a completely useless term for coding, and it requires immediate provider clarification. Seriously, if you see urosepsis written in a chart, treat it like a typo. Stop what you're doing and query. The guidelines explicitly state that urosepsis is not synonymous with sepsis. It doesn't even have a default code in the alphabetic index. You absolutely cannot assume they mean a urinary tract infection, and you definitely cannot assume they mean severe systemic sepsis. You've got to query the provider to find out exactly what clinical condition they are actually diagnosing.
Section 2, the Severe Sepsis Stack.
Let's move to the Severe Sepsis Stack and see how this builds into the strict architectural mandate of multi-code layering. This right here is where coders often make critical sequencing errors. Notice how the complexity scales up exponentially from baseline sepsis to severe sepsis and septic shock. We move from a single code requirement for baseline sepsis to a strict multi-code requirement. For severe sepsis and septic shock, you are fundamentally required to report the systemic infection first, followed by a specific severity code from subcategory R65.2, and finally, the codes for the actual organ dysfunctions that are occurring.
Remember, severe sepsis represents a systemic response where the infection is now causing organs to literally fail. But here's the catch. An acute organ dysfunction must be explicitly linked to the sepsis in the medical record to assign the severe sepsis code. If the patient has sepsis and they also have acute kidney failure, but the doctor notes the kidney failure is due to a medication toxicity rather than the sepsis, you do not code severe sepsis. The documentation must clearly and explicitly associate the two.
So, the crucial takeaway here is that coding severe sepsis requires an absolute minimum of 2 codes per the guidelines. But, practically speaking, it requires 3 once you factor in that required organ failure code. You simply cannot capture severe sepsis with a single line item. It's impossible.
Think of this as building a literal stack of blocks on your claim form. Your foundation at the bottom is your systemic infection, let's say A41.9. Then your middle layer snaps firmly into place right on top of it. This is your severity code, like R65.20 for severe sepsis without shock. And finally, the top layer drops down to complete the structure. This is your individual organ failure, like N17.9 for acute kidney injury. This severe sepsis mandate absolutely demands multi-code layering. If you miss a layer, the whole structure falls apart on your claim.
And what about septic shock? Well, if a provider documents septic shock,
That automatically represents an acute organ dysfunction, specifically circulatory failure. Therefore, it follows the exact same logical mapping as severe sepsis. You build the exact same stack. Systemic infection goes first, then R65.21 for severe sepsis with septic shock, and then any other organ failure codes. And here's a golden rule you can literally never forget. Septic shock can never be a principal diagnosis. No way. It always goes in a secondary slot behind the systemic infection.
Section 3. The Admission Crossroads.
We now arrive at a really critical fork in the road. How do you navigate the high-stakes sequencing choice when a localized infection pairs up with sepsis? Well, it hinges entirely on timing and the present on admission or POA status. If a localized condition, like a UTI or pneumonia, triggers sepsis, you've got to look at exactly when that sepsis triggered. If the patient comes through the emergency room doors and the sepsis is already running wild, the systemic sepsis code takes the coveted number 1 principal diagnosis spot, and the localized infection drops to number 2. But if they're admitted just for the localized infection and the sepsis develops later on, the rules completely flip.
Let's look at an example. If a patient is admitted for a localized infection, like a UTI, and sepsis hits them 3 days later while they're recovering on the inpatient floor, that UTI stays locked in the principal diagnosis spot. Even if the hospital ends up spending tens of thousands of dollars over the next 2 weeks treating the sepsis in the ICU, the UTI remains your principal diagnosis because that is what occasioned the admission in the first place. The sepsis codes drop to secondary diagnoses. Timing is absolutely everything here.
Section 4. Defeating payer denials. Now let's talk about a major, real-world operational nightmare, clinical validation audits. Insurance companies love to play doctor. They'll point at borderline lactic acid levels or white blood counts and just deny your sepsis codes outright, claiming the clinical criteria weren't met. But Guideline Section IA19 is your impenetrable defensive shield. It explicitly states that your coding must follow the provider's written statement that the condition exists. You're a coder, not a clinician. If the doctor wrote it, you code it. This keeps the claim fully approved against that incoming payer laser blast.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is that while clinical criteria definitely matter for your internal clinical documentation improvement teams when they're querying doctors, your ultimate coding allegiance is to the provider's written documentation. The guidelines even specify that negative or inconclusive blood cultures do not preclude a sepsis diagnosis as long as there's clinical evidence and a provider statement. Do not independently reassign or drop codes just because the lab work looks borderline to you. You code the provider's statement and you fiercely defend it with Section IA19.
Section 5. Final Coding Takeaways.
Let's wrap up this explainer with a final thought to really secure your sequencing strategy moving forward and keep your facility compliant. I want you to take a hard look at your facility today. Are your providers explicitly linking systemic infections and organ dysfunctions, or are they leaving the door wide open for payer takebacks? Mastering this multi-code stack and timing your principal diagnosis perfectly is the only way to protect your claims. So look at your last 5 sepsis charts. Would they actually survive a clinical validation audit today?